In addition, in addition to our habitat connectivity program, we also have the water quality program here at Wild Virginia, which I'm sure many of you are very aware of. And that's led by Mr. David Sly. So please be sure to tune in to some of those program events and advocacy opportunities that are upcoming. You'll also probably see an action alert coming out from Habitat Connectivity. So yours truly about some upcoming legislation and how to engage in that. So please be on the lookout for your inboxes the next day or so. I also want to thank Kylie that's running things in the background to keep us all in check and on time and make sure everything goes smoothly. We also have our two interns from UVA joining us tonight, and they'll help fill those questions at the end. So that's Julian and Sam. Please note that while Virginia can't do our work, we cannot advocate, we can't make a difference without your help. So we get our energy from you all, and that helps us keep pushing for better habitat connectivity and water quality protection. So thank you for your support. And support can look like a lot of different things. It can look like a donation. It can look like engaging in advocacy. So please help however you feel you can and know that we appreciate it and that we can't do it without you. So, without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our guest speakers this evening. First off, I want to introduce Mr. Jordan Green from the Division of Wildlife Resources. He's a district wildlife biologist with the Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources, serving terrestrial wildlife needs in 6 counties in Northern Virginia. So very, very busy. His duties include responses to human wildlife conflicts, wildlife disease monitoring, and addressing habitat and wildlife population management concerns. He's a native of southwestern Virginia. Jordan has worked around the country in various natural resource related roles in 9 different states, working for federal and state agencies as well as an NGO. Jordan has been with DWR for the past 6 years and has been working with students and staff from William and Mary's Institute for Integrated Conservation for the past 3 years. Jordan's proud to be a part of this partnership, which has led to investigating wildlife vehicle conflict primarily in Loudoun County. We also have for our speakers tonight, Percy and Taylor from the College of William and Mary. Percy is a recent graduate that studied integrative conservation, and he worked on the policy aspect of this research project, which explores methods of building support to motivate key actors to implement wildlife vehicle conflict mitigation structures. He's planning to pursue a career in wildlife conservation in the future. And as a resident of Loudoun County, he's interested in learning more about environmental issues that affect Virginia. In his free time, he enjoys making art and cycling. Taylor is a senior at William and Mary, majoring in environment and sustainability policy and sociology. As a part of the 2025 cohort of conservation research program, she studied how wildlife experience traffic noise and how sound data can help reduce wildlife vehicle conflict in Loudoun County, Virginia. Taylor is grateful for the opportunity to contribute research with DWR on long-term conservation efforts and plans to pursue a career in natural resource consulting after graduation. Outside of research, she enjoys bird watching, hiking, and running in her free time. Here's just some general contact information for us over at Wild Virginia, should you need it. And we'll use this as time to transition over to our speakers tonight. Jordan, whenever you're ready, we'll let you take it away and I'll stop sharing. Jordan, I
All
believe
right.
you might. There you
Yeah.
go.
So I
Gotcha.
just realized. Can everybody see my screen okay? Thumbs up. Okay, good. Um, so hi, like Trevor said, I am Jordan Green, and if you happen to live within a 6 county area of Northern Virginia, up close to DC, I am your terrestrial district wildlife biologist. Tonight, I'll be talking about the first 2 years of a 3-year plus partnership between DWR and William and Mary's Institute for Integrative Conservation, which I'll just say IIC from now on to make it simple, and the student research that's been accomplished. So, since the past student researchers have gone on to better things, you're unfortunately stuck with me telling their story. This is what it's really about. This is their story. Um, for my role, I saw a need to address a conservation issue and that I couldn't do alone, and I looked for help in the form of a proposal to the IIC in 2022. And as a side note, I first discovered about the IIC while attending a Virginia Safe Wildlife Corridor Collaborative meeting when I saw a call for proposals. So many thanks to the collaborative for connecting us. Um, so as Trapper mentioned, as a district biologist, one of my many roles is to address human wildlife conflict. In Northern Virginia, conflict with deer is a large priority as deer populations are overabundant. We also have lots of human development, and the two result in a number of deer vehicle collisions or deer vehicle collisions, actually, um, some of the highest in the state, specifically being in Loudoun County. So my proposal is simple. I wanted to identify where DVCs are happening the most often, look at local existing infrastructure, so bridges, culverts, and to see if installing wildlife fencing might be an option to funnel wildlife under roads safely instead of across roads. So the first project started in 2023 and included a creation of a citizen science app for filling data gaps in wildlife road mortality. The next year, we had 2 students working on 2 different projects centered around policy and a camera trap study. And last year, we again had 2 excellent students who are here tonight to present their work for you. And I promise they didn't pay me to say that they were excellent. Um, so outside of addressing um, human wildlife conflict as part of my job, why might we all care about addressing wildlife conflict or WVC? Well, probably the most obvious general reason is it's not good for wildlife and it's really not great for people either. From the wildlife perspective, we have impacts to wildlife that, of course, direct mortality and injury, loss of life, loss of habitat connectivity, human disturbance, and this takes on several dimensions. For example, noise disturbance from the road, which Taylor's going to talk more about tonight. Um, Behavioral modification. It can alter population demographics. It can mess with genetic gene flow, and it increases cortisol levels, stress hormones in wildlife around areas where they're kind of stressed out. So, and there's many more. These are the ones as I was putting together the presentation is just the big ones at the top of my head. And then from the human perspective, of course, we have injury and occasionally a human loss of life. And of course, property damage. There's disruption to commerce and delayed travel, and the emotional disturbance of having hit an animal or seeing animals on the side of the road. And again, there's a lot more impacts to both wildlife and humans that I don't have time to go into listen for this presentation. So, beginning in 2023, Alexa Busby, another bright student, who I believe now is on to her PhD program, she looked at 20 years worth of police crash records, indicating that there was a deer vehicle collision. And I want to note here that even though this is a long-standing data set, it really only represents a fraction of the number of deer hit by vehicles every year, as not all deer vehicle collisions are reported. The true number is likely greater than 9 times than that which is reported, maybe more. And that stems from previous studies. Initially looking at the data, pretty much every road in the county was covered in reports from the 20 years worth of data. So Alexa had to transform this data using statistical methods and was able to identify the top 10 hotspots or highest risk road segments in Loudoun County. For each of the top 10 sites, Alexa wrote a well-defined overview of why that road section was ranked, the specifics of the road itself, such as speed limit, local habitat value, if installation of wildlife fencing was feasible, if there was an existing bridge or culvert to tie the fencing into nearby. Um, And I know this slide is a little small and hard to read, so if you're interested in seeing a copy of her report for yourself or a copy of any of the published reports, just let me know. Um, Connect with me after and we can make sure we get you a copy. Um, in addition to some of the basic information about the road segment, Alexa also included details about known data from police reports, which sometimes included bare vehicle collision data, um, and also any specifics about existing infrastructure, such as bridges or culverts. And if those structures were suitable for wildlife use, which was also based on previous research completed by VDOT, or if the structures needed modification to improve the likelihood that wildlife would utilize the area for crossing. For example, a long, short, dark tunnel under a road isn't as appealing to, say, a prey species compared to a well-lit large underpass with a tall overhead. Additionally, Alexa created an app in Survey 123 with the intent of filling a much needed data gap and better understanding the scope and magnitude of wildlife vehicle conflict as it applies not only to deer, but any wildlife that cross a road and are at risk of being struck by a vehicle. Most of our data really stems from deer and to some extent bear, and we really don't have records of other things that get hit by cars. So foxes, turkey, raccoons, possums, you name it, skunks. I'm sure everybody is aware of those when they get hit. Um, so the design was fairly straightforward. The project was advertised as being a year-long project where volunteers would claim a weekend day every week where they would drive one of two pre-selected survey routes. And on the map here, you can see the two routes are running east to west. That's Route 7. And then I believe that's 15 running north to south, bisecting the county in two different ways. Um, and so on those routes, they recorded any live or dead animals they saw while driving the route. And also, as a side note here, I want to note that this project was a two volunteer minimum project where you had a driver and an observer, and the observer was the one doing the recording. This project continued for an entire year and culminated as you can see, with 1.7 thousand observations. And while this data hasn't been fully processed yet, DWR staff are currently working on expanding this app for other volunteer efforts around the state, and we hope to have to roll it out to an area near you in the coming future. I'm very excited about that. Our Watchable Wildlife Biologist is really focusing in on this citizen science aspect of the project. And an important thing to note about the data, why are we gathering this data outside of, it's helping us inform like what else is getting hit on the side of the road besides deer, and helping us kind of quantify the gaps in what we don't know about how many deer are getting hit. It's also vital to understand how to mitigate wildlife vehicle conflict, not just for large animals like deer, but also for smaller animals. Of course, the drawback to this type of survey is that very small animals are difficult to observe and they still get missed. And further research is needed in this area. So animals like frogs, salamanders, things like that. If you're driving at 55 miles an hour, we're not asking you to drive the road for 25 miles an hour to observe every living thing that's possibly there. In addition, scavengers come and collect those things pretty quickly, sometimes within hours, definitely within a day or two. And so those can get missed on a week-to-week survey. Um, Fast forward to 2024, and we had two students working on separate projects. The first, Kaylee Santella, who examined the policy behind going from no wildlife vehicle conflict mitigation to a fully implemented project, so 0 to 60. What does that look like? Her project entailed identifying the key actors along the policy pathway and learning how they connected to one another, as well as motivators and barriers to achieving wildlife vehicle conflict mitigation. And she did this by interviewing a lot of these different actors that you see in this connected matrix. Um, so here are three areas that Kaylee found in her study. First was what information to consider. Of course, we need to know about wildlife vehicle crash data. How can we fill in those gaps? And then once we have that data, how are we going to analyze that data and identify the highest risk areas? And as part of the planning process, it's important to collaborate with the wildlife agency, which happens to be DWR. Inclusion of wildlife vehicle conflict plans into long-range plans, inclusion of wildlife vehicle conflict considerations into the project scoping process, and areas of support included legislative mandates or other similar support measures, partnering with wildlife agencies like DWR, instilling environmental awareness. This is a literacy issue that we want to make sure that the people who are in these policy pathways are aware and informed about environmental stewardship. And then lastly, a really big important component of this is dedicated funding. As we'll see in the next slide here, funding is a major roadblock. From her study, recommended preliminary steps as you're initially taking those first steps into identifying the process. To gather supporting data. So if we can inform the decision makers, that's going to go a long way. And that includes the hotspot analysis, prioritizing locations, what types of mitigation strategies are out there. Fencing is one that I named. There's also changeable message signs. There's speed management and some others out there. And then estimating the costs of how much is that going to cost. Identifying the actors, who are the actors involved, and what is their role in the process. And then a big one is identifying their motivations and the barriers that they would have. So this research would involve the actors understanding their goals, the values, and their priorities, and then engaging the actors, inform and involve actors in the wildlife vehicle conflict project, constituent engagement or stakeholder engagement, and then citizen science can be deployed as a method to build support around a project. And then examine funding pools. So these are local departmental budgets, state budgets. There's also local, state, and or federal grants out there to be had at times. Nonprofit organizations can help rally support for funding, like Wild Virginia, which we're great to be able to share this information with you all through them tonight. And then, of course, private funding. The key takeaways from Kaylee's work in 2024 in examining these policy pathways is that there really is no existing clear decision-making pathway to wildlife vehicle conflict mitigation. So like identifying an area of need and then putting some kind of mitigation on the ground. There really, from a decision-making perspective, there wasn't a clear pathway. Despite this, she did identify the key actors. Of course, DWR would be a key actor, VDOT, the local municipal decision makers, and definitely the public. And of course, funding was one of the main barriers that she repeatedly encountered in her interviews with key stakeholders. And then, of course, conflicting priorities. It's, you only have so much money and you have to figure out how to address all of the issues with a limited funding source. And then probably the main thing that I put in bold here on this slide is that community support was consistently considered a primary driver from all of the, or at least most of the interviewees that she spoke to. So that is something we like to focus in on more in the future. And now, on that same year, 2024, we also had another student, Sophia Polite. She did a 3-month study where she took a closer look at 7 of the top 10 hotspot areas. As I mentioned before, or maybe I didn't, of the 10 top hotspots in Loudoun County, not all of them had suitable infrastructure nearby where you could tie wildlife fencing into a crossing structure. Maybe a bridge or a culvert didn't even exist. So we're looking at kind of low hanging fruit, low cost, low effort as much as possible where we can start and really dig in and make an example that we can showcase. And so Sophia kind of took this to the next level in this study where she uh, took 20 cameras, cell cameras. She deployed those at 7 bridges and culverts, and she ended up getting over, thousands of photos captured. And another note here I added in my notes to say that's important is that it fencing, ideally there'd be lots of places where we could install wildlife fencing and tie it into culverts or bridges and funnel wildlife under roads. But the reality is here on the East Coast, especially in these increasingly developed areas, is that there just are a lot of driveways, intersections, on-ramps and off-ramps. And for wildlife fencing on the side of the road to be effective, you need to have a good distance away from this crossing site. So about a mile or so on either side of the crossing for it to be effective. Um, so some key takeaways from Sophia's study is that there's definitely strong evidence that all of the 7 sites that wildlife are using these sites to cross under the roads. And this sets a baseline for potential future studies examining any post mitigation. So if we were able to put some fence installation in, we could go back in with some camera trapping again and quantify the changes to any wildlife use at these crossing areas, further kind of bolstering support for these projects. Another key aspect of her work involved examining all the photos and how best to do this in a rapid and efficient way. As you can imagine, it could take quite some time to go through a couple 100,000 photos. And she wanted to do this as an example to anyone else who might want to take on a similar camera trapping project and bolster the data behind the need for putting up wildlife fencing. She found that the use of a machine learning website or artificial intelligence website called Wildlife Insights was helpful in rapidly detecting animal presence or absence in a photo and cataloging that data for analysis. Additionally, there's also the possibility of using this idea of sorting photos to engage the public as a citizen science project to help bolster a broader awareness of the problem and help potentially ultimately support future mitigation efforts. Um, and then lastly here, I wanted to make a note. It's not directly tied into the student research that's been done with William and Mary, but in 2025, DWR was awarded $450,000 from the general fund. This was a bill in the state house and Senate that passed. And the language of the bill says this money is to be used to target high priority wildlife crossing projects. So I will say that the tie-in here is that the work that the William and Mary students are doing is very relevant, and it is helping us address a conservation challenge in real time, which is pretty rare. Like as an undergraduate student myself, I was probably just figuring out how to properly wash my clothes, and these students are going above and beyond and really putting in some good effort work and are highly motivated and passionate about what they do. And this is an example of that where Alexa Busby's work in identifying these high priority areas in Loudoun County have actually brought us to current date time. We're actually looking at spending that $450,000 on one of the prioritized sites that Alexa Busby found. So hopefully in the not too distant future, if you happen to be driving near Percyville on Route 7, east or west, you'll see this wildlife fencing coming up. Um, that's our hope. And then again, our hope is that continues to be yet another feather in our cap to showcase what is possible when we have these partnerships come together. Like I said, I could not never have done this work by myself as a DWR employee. Like Trapper mentioned in the beginning, I cover 6 counties in Northern Virginia. I think I estimated that at about 2.5 million people. You think about all of the problems that arise between humans and wildlife, the regulatory side, the policy side. I touch so many of those things, and having the assistance from William and Mary has been crucial at getting some focus and attention brought to this and creating pathways to support this work. Um, so I can't say enough for William and Mary's IIC program and VISWIC, the Virginia Safe Wildlife Corridor Collaborative. And with that, I will hand it over to Percy, who will talk about, he will start out with his part of the work in 2025, followed by Taylor's work that she just completed this past year. And I will stop sharing my screen once I figure out how to do that. There we go.
Can everyone see my screen? Okay, awesome. So, hello everyone. Thank you for coming today. My name is Percy Zimering, and I'm going to be talking about my project in which I examined how to build support for wildlife vehicle conflict mitigation structures. So we know that mitigation structures such as overpasses, underpasses, and fencing greatly reduce wildlife vehicle conflict. These structures have been shown to reduce collisions by upwards of 80%, so they're a really great strategy. But to actually implement this, we need collaboration between many actors, which is why it's necessary to identify best practices for building support, which is what my project aims to address. So my research question is, how can Virginia organizations and agencies build groundswell support to motivate the Virginia Department of Transportation to implement wildlife vehicle conflict mitigation structures? And my objectives were to understand how to address roadblocks, explore strategies for building support, and learn what has led to successful implementation in other states. I explored these objectives by interviewing members of key organizations to understand the current state of mitigation efforts. And my project builds on that previous student research that Jordan talked about, where a student interviewed key actors to understand their role in the implementation process. So I followed up with several of these candidates, but I also broadened my scope to include additional environment and transportation related organizations, both within and outside of the state of Virginia. So these candidates participated in semi-structured interviews that lasted about 30 to 60 minutes, and I analyzed the transcripts to identify major points brought up and connected these points to my objectives. So from these interviews, I found that there were about three top challenges: funding, data gaps, and a lack of clarity about the implementation process. So unsurprisingly, funding was the most commonly mentioned issue because wildlife crossings are competing with many priorities and they have high upfront costs, which some people feel are inhibitory towards actually implementing them. But it's important to note that these structures are associated with long-term savings because of the high costs associated with wildlife vehicle collisions. For example, a project that added fencing along I-64 saved an estimated $2.3 million within 2 years of completion. So these structures can be economically feasible, but it's necessary to identify hotspots to make the best use of limited funds. And then as for data, Wildlife vehicle conflict is really underreported right now. Um, it mostly comes from police reports and a few other sources that just don't capture the full scope of the issue. And in particular, it underrepresents the impact on small species such as reptiles, many of which are of conservation concern, but they're just hard to keep track of, so they're not very well reflected in these numbers. So more comprehensive data could help understand how to best address this issue. And then the third issue is there's confusion about how to move forward with implementation because some organizations are discussing wildlife vehicle conflict mitigation, um, but the discussions are largely theoretical. There's just confusion about how to move forward, and a lot of members of environmental organizations describe it as a systemic issue because wildlife needs are not currently considered in the transportation planning process. Um, so then I tried to explore strategies for building support, and some major strategies that came up were public engagement, interorganizational collaboration, and demonstrating efficacy through data. So, public awareness of this issue has been increasing in recent years, and it generally receives a lot of support across demographics. Because this issue is important from many angles. It's important to people who are interested in protecting the environment. It's good from a public safety standpoint, and people just don't like roadkill. So it generally receives positive responses, and the role of public engagement, we could do more to figure out like how exactly to transfer this into momentum, but it's likely that public support places pressure on decision makers to act on this issue. And then interorganizational collaboration is very useful for sharing and discussing skills, news, and challenges. It can occur at the local, state, or even interstate level. And this is already a strong point in Virginia through organizations like VISWIC. So it's definitely a good thing to keep up. Pretty much every interviewee mentioned this. Um, and then third point, demonstrating efficacy through data. Like I said, there are those data gaps, but having additional data helps justify the need for mitigation and helps us allocate funds appropriately. Also, our main study area, Loudoun County, could be seen as a pilot project, and demonstration of success in this area may incentivize other counties to pursue wildlife vehicle conflict mitigation. And then, last point, citizen science can play a dual role of filling these data gaps and also engaging the public on this issue. I also spoke to um, members of organizations in other states, particularly Colorado, North Carolina, and Oregon, as well as one person who worked nationwide. And there were a few factors associated with success in these states. Um, First of all, Western states tend to be ahead with wildlife vehicle conflict mitigation, and part of the reason for this is their ecological conditions. They have large migratory species such as elk, which are, first of all, very dangerous to collide with, and second of all, there are years and years of data tracking their migration patterns. So these conditions have made Western states more conducive to implementing preventative measures earlier on. But a lot of Eastern states are starting to catch up. Um, and there are a few strategies that these states have employed to be successful. One is having a strong relationship between the State Department of Transportation and the State Wildlife Agency. So some examples of this happening are in Colorado. There's strong collaboration between the Alliance, which is their equivalent to VISWIC, and the Colorado Department of Transportation. The Alliance plays a role in identifying priority projects, which they pass along to the Department of Transportation, and they consider these so it helps environmental concerns be addressed during transportation projects. And then in North Carolina, there's an official recognition of the relationship between the Department of Transportation and the Wildlife Resource Commission through a memorandum of understanding, um, which outlines their partnership. And the candidate I spoke to from North Carolina said that implementing a memorandum of understanding or an MOU is his one recommendation for states that do not have one. And right now, Virginia does not have one, so it would be a good thing to look into. Another factor associated with success is having clear multi-actor decision-making processes. So in North Carolina, they have something called a merger process, which is a detailed step-by-step process that allows the Wildlife Resource Commission to provide input into transportation projects. And they also have a dedicated liaison position between Wildlife Resource Commission and North Carolina Department of Transportation. So this helps boost communication between these agencies and it helps ensure that wildlife-related concerns are addressed during project planning at every step of the process. In Oregon, there's been state legislation passed that directed greater efforts towards wildlife crossings by directing agency efforts and allocating funding. And then in Colorado, there was an executive order in 2019 that facilitated collaboration between key actors and highlighted the alliance's importance in recommending priority projects. So, this language from officials supporting organizations that care about wildlife vehicle conflict has done a lot to help these states mitigate these collisions. So, some recommendations based on the findings from the interviews are, first of all, to improve our data sets. And some ways of working towards this are with citizen science and the use of improved applications, which are in the process of being introduced. Um, and then we should continue to foster collaboration among Virginia organizations. We're already on the right track. We just need to keep doing it. Um, and then public input may influence decision makers by pressuring them to do more towards this issue. And where politically feasible, further collaboration between state wildlife and transportation organizations would be very beneficial, as we've seen from other states. So I hope this project provides insight on how to build support for wildlife crossings, and hopefully this will help us move forward with implementing these important structures that protect both people and wildlife. So thanks for listening, and now I'll pass things along to Taylor.
Thank you so much, Percy. I'm going to be sharing my screen soon. All right. Is everyone able to see my screen? Okay. So, hi, my name is Taylor. Thank you so much for coming to this presentation. And my presentation is focused on the sound of safety, reducing wildlife vehicle conflicts with acoustic data in Loudoun County, Virginia. And so this is actually a nice transition from Jordan's background information to Percy's policy side of presentation to mine. And so my focus of my presentation is on an acoustic study, and it is essentially looking at how noise plays as a role of wildlife vehicle conflicts, and how it can be played as a way to actually mitigate the wildlife vehicle conflicts, as not as only a factor of wildlife vehicle conflicts, but also as a role. There you go. And ideally, we would hope for safer and quieter wildlife passages by understanding wildlife experiences after taking some acoustic data. Oop. So as some background, I want to show some information on sensory ecology. And so as we know, road ecology has been a widely known area of study. And so more specifically, my research is focused on sensory ecology and how things such as noise, not as much as light this time, but noise impacts the way that wildlife approaches an underpass or avoids an underpass and such. And so we've already seen this many times in literature and in practice. So right now, like several government and like private literature has shown how like people have used fencing, as we mentioned before, also ramps, reduce speed limits or signs, or jump outs or vegetation as ways to reduce wildlife vehicle conflicts. And so these are things that are commonly known and also options in the future that we'll get into. And so on top of that, considering that there is a lot of different options, we will also need to consider the road edge effect established by Foreman in 1998. And so he was talking about how roads physically make up 1% of land use in the USA. But if you consider the road edge effect, if its impacts of how roads impact wildlife, the natural environment, and humans, that makes up 15 to 20% of the country. And so in consideration of that, the whole point is that roads do not just affect just directly between the lines of pavement, but also amongst the natural environment that the wildlife live in. And so more specifically to my study on an acoustic baseline study, I used decibels to assess how loud these noise levels are next to the road and a little bit out towards the road, but using decibels, like I said. And on the side of the image, we see how these decibels in the ranks of 10 are kind of equivalent to like how a human would hear anything else. And so, for example, like a refrigerator is a quiet hum, or a quiet office would be like 40 decibels, But if you go to like a 90 decibels, that is where like the level of like how loud a hair dryer is or blender or power tools. And so a lot of my research, a little bit of a sneak peek, is that our decibels do fall between like 60 to 90. And so considering um, how loud that may be in an everyday life for wildlife, that is quite significant. And even in the 70 range, it says that there's traffic available there, and as well as a police siren, which is found on roads as 80 as well, and motorcycles for 100 as well. And so to put this into perspective, every increase of 10 decibels is a tenfold increase in sound intensity, which means that if there's a 20 decibel increase from 60 to 80, that's 100 times louder of the sound energy. And so to put that in perspective, a wildlife, that means that there's really very rare times for them to experience like 0 decibels or like 10 decibels, if that makes sense. And so this leads to my research question of how can the collection of soundscape data help mitigate wildlife vehicle conflicts in Loudoun County, Virginia? And so my objectives that I aim to reach were examine the relationship between wildlife and traffic noise, uh, explore how traffic sound levels are impacted by environmental conditions, such as elevation, vegetation, and distance, and also create recommendations for decision makers who are also on this call based on the empirical data. And so moving on to methods, what did our 10 weeks of data collection look like? And so we had very basic equipment such as handheld acoustic monitors, GPS monitors, and general field equipment like flags and field tape and stuff like that. We collected our sound data at the previously identified hotspots mentioned from Sophia's work and Alexa's work. And so instead of the 7 sites that Sophia looked at, I looked at the 6. And specifically, they are Percival East, Percival West, Sickland, Belmont, Hamilton, and Ashburn. These are the areas of the towns that like where the wildlife infrastructure already is at. And so we want to create a comparison study between areas with and without a crossing structure to see the impacts and the usefulness of a bridge or a culvert. And so we also consider other features, like I mentioned, like vegetation, elevation, and distance that we will go into more later. And so my first finding is that distance has a strong relationship with sound. This is a very expected finding, considering we just know how naturally as distance increases, sound decreases. And so this just really shows a capture or screen capture of like what the current state of like noise levels look like in the natural environment as distance increases. And so this is a nice reflection of if you go back to the previous image of like the decibel levels of like 60 to 80, that's what it's kind of referring to. And we noticed significantly that like the green transect line is a lot more linear and flatter than the reference one, and it's a lot more steeper. And so this may be an explanation of considering that the treatment transect is measured below the road or below the culvert or bridge. And so that may be an explanation. And this is actually ideal since we ideally want the treatment transect line to be as flat as possible, considering that we want wildlife to experience the minimal amount of noise. And so keeping that line as flat as possible is probably is the best goal to achieve when it comes to noise studies. So, and the second finding is vegetation. So vegetation was scored with a scale from 0 to 4. 0 is no vegetation to very dense vegetation. And so, as you can tell, the treatment transect is at a pretty obvious decline, but the reference transect without a bridge or culvert, by the way, is very flat, almost flat even. And so this is very expected and unexpected. I assumed that treatment or vegetation is going to be a helpful indicator of like reducing sounds, but also very surprised that the reference transect is very flat. And so this kind of gives considerations of how vegetation may be a strong consideration as a strategy that we will get into soon. And so the first recommendation I have is that considering all of these findings, instead of rather giving you guys all a recommended like a list of priorities of which sites to prioritize first. It's more up to decision makers to know which site they want to select based on certain factors. And these are some of the factors. So vegetation, there are certain areas, certain sites that have very low density scores or very high density scores. And so if the decision makers want to pick like areas with the least vegetation, you'll definitely look into vegetation that will add more vegetation. But if there's already high vegetation, you'll look at areas or you will look at the same sites and look for maintenance cost. And the same with elevation. If there's flat elevation, you can include berms and fences. And there's already elevation, there are other ways to improve that as well. The same goes with noise range disturbance. Based on cost, feasibility, and funding and everything, noise range disturbance is also a big consideration. Whether if you have a large range, that means that there's a lot of variety of noises, and that means there's a lot more to mitigate compared to small ones that are already consistently lower. And lastly, Sophia Polite has already looked at the highest areas of biodiversity. So that also adds some extra data of which areas to focus on, which includes Percival East, Percival West, and Belmont. And so my second recommendation is vegetation, generally, as I mentioned in my second finding, as an effective strategy to reduce sound for quieter passage. And so this is a solid recommendation since it uses nature to mitigate a conservation conflict. And so although vegetation maintenance could be very high, the long-term effects for using nature to guide wildlife to safer passage is definitely worth it, in my opinion. And also planting functional plant species near entrances can act as a source of food and sound buffer for wildlife. And lastly, low cost, essentially much lower cost than like building another crossing structure or fence. So it's great as a low cost alternative. And so lastly, we have our limitations of future research. And so if anyone is a statistician in here, they know that like my research has very little like acoustic samples, or there's not enough to create more accurate results. And so a lot of acoustic sampling is needed for this kind of study, and also that this is serving as a baseline study as well. And then for future research, if we want to continue a more in-depth analysis, we need more funding, equipment, and time, and also as well as people to be on the field and like, taking all this time to conduct the research. You can also look at more specific plant species to help attract wildlife to underpasses, which ones are functional and which ones are not as functional. And if in future studies, we can also look into factors such as light and seasonality and how that could be used as a way to guide wildlife to safer passages instead of going on roads, and also re-examine elevation as a factor of sound reduction. I did not mention this in my slides, but elevation was not the most, had a very mixed results. So reevaluating elevation as a factor of sound reduction may be useful. So thank you.
Right. Thank you so much. What a great presentation from all three panelists, presenters. At this time, we will transition into question and answers. Sam, Julian, want to take us away?
I think the first question I'm going to read out is a question from Martha Weiss, and this kind of echoes another question made by Gail Cheney. Martha Weiss' question is, if you look at this issue purely from an economic standpoint, there's so much money to be saved from wildlife corridors. Specifically, insurance companies would save millions of dollars yearly if these collisions would be decreased with boundaries. Where do insurance companies fit into this problem, and can they be tapped for funding?
Trapper, I think that might be more of a question on your side of the house.
I can try to answer that, and Jordan or Percy, Taylor, feel free to jump in from what you all have gathered. But I think that's kind of a touchy subject for the insurance companies, unfortunately. We do receive a lot of the collision data from insurance companies. In fact, the stat that we receive and cite often is from State Farm that actually claims Virginia being in the top 10 for wildlife vehicle collisions. I think we're sitting at number 10 this year. It moves slightly up and down. Um, and I know that we have reached out to insurance companies to talk to them about, say, some of the legislation we're working on this year to create sustainable funding for crossings and corridor work. So we're working on a wildlife corridor grant fund, and we haven't got any commitments. I guess I'll leave it at that from the insurance companies, but I agree. It seems like there's a role for them to play, and we hope they will get on board at some point, and we're certainly not giving up on trying to get them involved.
Mhm.
Based on
Great.
my
Well,
interviews, I saw this discussion was happening in a few other states, and I guess it's a recent development, but so far they say they haven't had much success getting insurance companies involved. They're trying to have them involved in sort of their version of this WIC, but it's just not getting off the ground.
Yeah, I'll say from a biologist perspective, when it comes to the wildlife on the natural landscape that we all live in, that we're all part of it, and that everybody plays a role in one way or another. And sometimes it is a matter of convincing folks of how to play that role properly. Um, from my day to day, it's making sure people aren't feeding wildlife illegally, doing interacting with wildlife in ways that aren't healthy for wildlife or people for that matter. And so from the broad perspective, yeah, there's everyone has a role to play. And I want to just go back one thing that I forgot to mention, and of course the students are like the star players of all this research, but I also want to mention the staff at William and Mary that have helped them along the way, specifically Professor John Swaddle has been just brilliant with the way he's been able to help guide these students on the academic side, and of course Erica Garrett, who's the program lead over there with IIC. So a shout out to them. Thank you.
Okay, we have another question from Margie Halpin on box turtles. So box turtles in Northern Virginia, what kind of may be known about the box turtle movements, like seasonal patterns, road crossing behavior, etc. For context, they say they saw a box turtle trying to cross Route 7 at Sugarland Run. By the time they had pulled their car off into a safe location and ran back to move the turtle, the car had hit the turtle. Then within a few weeks, a second box turtle had been seen in the Sugarland Run vicinity trying to cross the four-lane Fairfax County Parkway.
So I can't speak to like the level of data on a broad scale or even a local scale of what especially herps, because they're harder to identify being smaller and not and carcasses not remaining on the landscape long enough for like a weekly survey to capture that data. But I will say the bright side is that if there is a place where wildlife fencing can be installed, there is the option of having materials that are specific to herps and smaller animals to keep them off the road. In addition to that, I would say, of course, signage only goes so far. Everybody has seen a deer sign and ignored it at some point in their life. Um, and so you could have some signage that might have some impact, but I would say a stronger impact would be some kind of mitigation, physical mitigation that would channel those animals off the road, but also some speed management, making people aware, like, hey, let's slow it down in this area. This is a known area, and those are from the research that I've been partnering with William and Mary so far. We really haven't tapped into that level of research yet. It's definitely something that we've kicked around as a potential study project in the future. And we do have two students who I just met yesterday for the first time, and we're still working on some project ideas. So it's good that people care about these things and make it vocal to us so that At the end of the day, from my perspective, I'm a public servant and I'm trying to protect the environment and meet the needs of the public.
Our next question comes from Lydia B. What are the next steps for individuals to take to move this work forward?
I can try to tackle that one. I think there's a lot of different ways to engage. From my perspective as being a member of the public, again, there's current legislation to contact, your representatives, your delegate, your senator to say, hey, I support this. I want to see this through. This matters to me. Personal, testimony, personal stories of vehicle collision incidents or almost incidents are really important to share those stories, those personal stories. So I think that is a great way. I think what you're doing tonight, being on here, learning more, is a huge step and spreading the word. There's just so many people that don't even know this is an issue until the conflict happens or the collision happens. So I do think it's just educating ourselves and spreading the word and trying to get engaged however you feel comfortable to try to help this issue be more known because there are, just like these folks have outlined, there are so many solutions. And it may cost a little bit more money up front, but the long term, it's cost savings, and of course we're saving wildlife and even our lives and safety. So
Yeah, I'll say from the state's perspective, we are not in a place of advocacy, but um, data gathering. So, working with William and Mary, getting the facts and presenting the facts to the people that we can uh, make sure that decision makers are making informed decisions with the data that we have. Um, so that's kind of the main place where we want to go, and that's where I mentioned in the beginning of my presentation. I'm really excited about the rollout of a potential statewide data collection app on roadkill. That this, from my perspective, and just doing the trial run and load testing the app before it went out live to the volunteers for the Loudoun County project, is that day after day going out and looking on these predetermined routes, the number of animals that collect just from one day over to the next is pretty appalling. And it's that kind of thing, getting citizens involved, because these kind of decisions where funding gets placed really comes from the public. And it's hard, this is where the collaborative, Wild Virginia, there are others out there that help kind of organize that effort and target that in a positive way.
just to add to, because Jordan made me think about it, there's the state level, advocacy that you can engage in, but it's also just getting to know who your city council representative is or your county council, and getting to know them, form a relationship, and let them know your concerns. Bringing it down to that local level often works really well too. So just wanted to add that.
Another question from Gregory Fristian. Does lighting of underpasses have to be done intelligently to avoid leaving the wildlife with temporary night blindness while they're returning into the natural landscape over the far side of the road?
That's a good question. So my understanding of that is that you would actually probably shy away from any artificial lighting. There are two uh, wildlife crossing box culverts that were specifically designed in Virginia. They're in Fairfax on military property, but the way they solved the lighting issue is that in the median between the two roads, they have a grate that allows natural light to come in and penetrate into the box culvert itself. So it's a much more natural setting and feel for wildlife. Outside of that, I'm certain that artificial light could be used. I haven't really looked at it too closely, but I would assume that you would want to have lighting that probably turns off at nighttime to accommodate exactly what you're talking about. But that's an interesting topic and something worth considering.
Great. We have
Sam, Julian, I was just going to say maybe a couple more questions. That way we're respectful of our speaker's time. Just a few more.
Yeah, of course. I think last question I have on my end is a question from Tom Benzing is, are there bills in current General Assembly that we should be watching?
There absolutely are. I can speak to that. So be on the lookout for HB 597. That is our huge priority this year. That's the creation of a wildlife corridor grant fund. So that'll create a sustainable funding mechanism that will basically go into a bucket, and then folks can apply for grants through that fund, through that bucket. And it'll fund everything from construction projects, so adding fencing, like what Jordan has talked about, to upsizing culverts. So the actual construction ready projects, but also feasibility studies, monitoring, research, meetings, trainings, anything to do with corridors, preservation and connectivity and crossings. And it's going to be seeded or funded. The fund will be funded by two voluntary funding or two voluntary donation mechanisms. So one will be a checkbox where you make electronic transactions with the Department of Motor Vehicles. So if you go to renew your registration or renew your license online, there'll be an option for you to say, yes, I want to donate towards the Wildlife Corridor Grant Fund. And I think the minimum, there'll be a minimum amount, and then there'll be like an open box amount where you can just donate however much you feel. So totally voluntary. And then the other option is also voluntary. When you receive your income tax filings, there'll be an option there to check and donate towards the Wildlife Corridor Grant Fund. That one's really, really important and probably our biggest priority. We've already seen a couple other pieces of legislation essentially be tabled. So they're not going anywhere this year, and they had something to do with funding or related to wildlife crossings as well. But again, those are not moving forward this year. So our eyes are really on this HB 597. The patron or the sponsor is Delegate Simons. So if you are in her jurisdiction, I would certainly recommend reaching out to her. She is our champion, and there'll will no doubt be some co-sponsors on there as well. But we could see this presented in some subcommittee as early as tomorrow, but likely next week. So definitely be sure you're on our distribution list for action alerts, because we will be sending something out for people to letter write and engage. So thank you. Great question.
Do we have time for one more question or one last one? So what studies have been done on WVC in neighborhoods, particularly those with main roads that are not as fast or as busy as the thoroughfares we discussed, but that still have strikes with deer and foxes and other suburban animals? Fences and underpasses don't really seem practical. What other mitigations can be done in these areas?
So as far as studying these areas, I think that's the next level of kind of app data that we're looking at. We haven't really teased it out yet, but having a sort of an iNaturalist style app where we have ad hoc data, the difference between what that would do versus what we currently have is if you have an app where you're getting data on a weekly basis from 1 week for a whole year, that information is standardized and regulated in a way that is comparable, compared to an app where people just have access to something and collect data when they feel like it. That data is a little bit harder to, there's some high-powered statistics that need to go in to make that data useful. But that's not to say that it's not something we're considering in the future. It's definitely something I want to see, and that will help get better information on these kind of secondary, tertiary roads. And at minimum, that information will help design better risk models for all kinds of species. And then in terms of mitigation on these smaller roads, it's exactly something that I looked at in the first year when we were looking at culvert and bridges across Loudoun County. I can't remember how many we walked through, but in some of these places, it's not feasible, and that's really the pinch point when it comes to wildlife fencing is the feasibility issue. Um, so that is an area where these problem areas need to be identified using data, and then mitigation measures. Like I said before, the ones that come to mind, of course, are signage, changeable message signing for anything that might be seasonal. There are new technologies on the horizon that are being used effectively in some places, and I suspect those are only going to get better and more prolific in the future. But things that use like radar detection, thermal imaging, things like that to detect when wildlife are actually on the road. And then they light up, hey, slow down, there's actually an animal on the road that you're about to hit. That kind of technology would be very useful in the future. But again, funding is a major issue. All these things cost money to maintain, they cost money to install. Um, and there's just a culture of a cultural shift that needs to happen to make that more part of our daily life and routine. But this is where it all starts, is getting people involved. And like Trapper said, just having you guys here today, hearing about the work that we're doing, and by no means are we the only ones looking at this. There's other folks in the state looking at it. There's other folks in the country looking at it. Definitely globally, it's being looked at as an issue. And so hopefully as more people are interested in it's definitely, in my opinion, a bipartisan issue. It affects all of our daily lives, and it's an important thing to address from the ecological, natural world that we live in perspective as well, beyond just the public safety risks.
Well put, Jordan. And with that, I think we'll respect our speaker's time tonight. And I don't know if y'all have been paying attention to the chat, but you're getting a lot of love and a lot of thanks over there from everyone who joined. So thank you so much for your time and sharing this important information with us. And I took a bunch of notes and learned more about these projects that I already knew about. So thank you all so much. Please stay in touch, and I hope everyone has a good night. Stay tuned for updates from Wild Virginia, and certainly be on the lookout to see what these bright men and young men and women do in the future, because sounds like they're going to do some really great things for our wildlife and for our safety on our roads. So thank you all for joining. Have a good night.